Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about why experimentation is so important, basically the importance of how we run actually experiments. But before we go there, let's review a little bit about history. So the concept of medical doctors has existed for around 2,400 years. Since the era of Hippocrates, we have medical doctors. And for these past 2,400 years, doctors were convinced that they were doing the right treatments for treating diseases for their patients. And more important, patients would put their faith into these doctors. For the first 2,300, both were wrong. Professor David Goodon does a very good analysis of the different medical treatments that were used. And he discovered that the majority of these treatments actually wouldn't work. Worse than that, many would actually hurt their patients. So does anyone know what was the most common medical procedure until the 20th century? Bloodletting. Perfect, you guys are good. What is bloodletting for those who don't know? You open a vein to a patient and you let them drain blood. That was a whole medical procedure. And the theory behind bloodletting was that these diseases would live inside the blood. So if the blood would go away, well, the patient would get cured. And bloodletting was actually better than aspirin. You could use it for many things, from cancer to tetanus to acne. Anything could be cured by bloodletting. In 1836, Dr. Pierre Louis ran what we probably consider the first clinical trial or control experiment. And what he did was he had patients with pneumonia, and he treated these. He's divided this group into two groups, and one he used bloodletting, and the other ones he does not. He did not. What he found was that bloodletting wasn't actually helping cure the patients; was actually killing them. So, what I think is important to understand is bloodletting was used for 2,000 years. So the question we ask ourselves is, how on earth now we realize that bloodletting wasn't helping? This was the most common medical procedure. It wasn't just another medical procedure. It was the most common medical procedure. And what we learned from this is it's not trivial to understand whether something works. Because many of these patients would get cured after bloodletting, but of course not because of bloodletting. The other thing we learned is that we can actually be wrong for 2,000 years. So before you guys start asking whether this is the right conference or this is a different room, and we're still talking about programming or Python here, this is what we're going to be talking today. So how common is to be wrong? How common is that we think that something works when in reality it does not? And why this happens? The second thing we're going to be talking is how do we really test whether an idea works? And the third one is, how do we put actually this into practice? So, do we really think that the issue with bloodletting was something that happened in the 19th century, so now that we are in the 21st century, this doesn't happen anymore? Do we still have this problem? And the answer is yes. Qualpro is a company that is dedicated to measure whether idea works or not. And they work for many companies. They've been measuring for the last 22 years, 150,000 ideas. And these were not any ideas. These were ideas that companies or organizations really believed that they were good ideas, enough to put them in production and to put investment on them. What do they learn? Only 25% of these ideas actually worked. 53% didn't work but didn't hurt. And 22% actually make the process worse, meaning that actually made the metric go the opposite direction that they were supposed to work. And this is real numbers. These are real companies. These are real good ideas. This is not any idea. These are real good ideas. So what do we learn from this? If we believe in our intuition to judge whether an idea works or not, 75% of the time we will be wrong. But I don't want you guys to take this for granted, so I'm going to play a little game right now. I need everybody to stand up. We have surprises, so don't be afraid. So I'm gonna show you 3 control experiments that we run, and you're gonna judge every one of you are going to judge whether it's a good idea or not. The first one is a real experiment, not run by us, but run by the Obama campaign before the election. The metric they wanted to move was number of people that actually sign up for they give the email to the campaign. So this was the original one. You have Obama, you have a color background, and the new one, you have Obama with his family. So for those who think that this one, A, is better than B, you raise your left hand. For those who think there's no significant difference, don't raise any hand. And for those who think B is better than A, you raise your right hand. Okay? So actually, this one was much better. So anybody that raised not the right hand, please sit down. The rest keep stand up. Okay, so we have a lot of winners. So actually, this one was 14.6 better on the sign-up rate. This is huge. This represented 2.8 million email addresses throughout the campaign, more for the Obama campaign. Let's go for the second one. This is an experiment that we ran ourselves in Microsoft. It was the older MSN version. And if you see here the difference, I don't know if everybody can see, but the difference between A and B is this one has a small image on search. This one has a search. So if you think the metric that we want to move is number of searches. So if you think that A is better than B, you raise your left hand. B is better than A, right hand. No difference, no hand. Ready? So if you raise any hand, please sit down. There was no significant difference between the two. And what is important about this is the fact that there was a huge amount of discussions on this. Designers would fight each other, say, no, this is better than this. At the end of the day, we need to test. So let's go to the third one. So we have just a few players now. This is an Office Online, another experiment we run for MSN, for Office Online. And they always see that the main metric that we want to move was number of clicks in the buy links. So these are the buy links here, and these are the buy links here. So if you think that A is better than B, left hand, A is worse than B, right hand, no difference, no hands. Always see the metric is to drive traffic to the actual buy page. So if you click here, you would land in the buy page. That's the metric that we want to move. Ready? Okay, so actually A was 64% better than B. So who won? So let me tell you one thing. If you done this game just random, there would be more people winning today. So we know intuition is not reliable to judge ideas. But the other question we have is, well, once we put an idea into production, like the doctors did with bloodletting, why is it so difficult to understand whether the idea works? And the problem here is what we call the human beings learn from cause and effect. We are small, we touch an electrical outlet, we receive a shock, we learn that we don't need to touch it. It works for the majority of the cases, but it's not perfect. So for example, this is my nephew. He lives in Uruguay. Every time he goes to the airport, I'm there. He's convinced I live in the airport. The issue is that we learn from correlation. We learn from correlated events. But, like many people will tell you, correlation doesn't imply causation. Means that the two events are correlated doesn't imply that one caused the other one. We'll go review a few examples. This is a correlation between the number of cell phones per country and the CO2 emissions by that country. And this is a very nice correlation. With this, I can tell you how much CO2 is emitted by country just by knowing how many cell phones they have. But the question is, can we really say that the cell phones are generating the CO2? And of course the answer is no. If tomorrow Canada decides to ban the cell phones, they will still have the same amount of CO2. So again, they are correlated. That doesn't mean that one implies the other one. Another example, how many of you know what is the correlation with the size of the hand? So the bigger the hand, does anyone know? So the bigger the hand, the less amount of years you will live, for those who think it was a good idea to have a bigger hand. So before you guys start being afraid of the size of your hand. The reason this happens is men, on average, have bigger hands than women, and we also, on average, live at least a few years less than women, on average. So if you put all the information together, you see a very clear correlation with the size of the hand. But at the end of the day, the size of the hand has nothing to do with the amount of life you will live. The third example is our own correlation study we did this morning. We had a bunch of researchers that they did a correlation between good Python programmers and hotels in Toronto. So for some reason we don't understand yet, we found a very clear correlation with Chestnut residents and Python programmers. So probably this will be in the newspaper tomorrow, saying if you want to learn Python, you need to stay at the Chestnut. But even though, again, we need to repeat ourselves, correlation doesn't imply causation. But even though this seems trivial, many times we don't get it. This is a real example. This is a published study in 1999 from the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center. They found a very strong correlation between children that would sleep with the lights on and the probability of them getting myopia. And I don't know how to pronounce that, but I think it's myopia. Myopia? Myopia, perfect. So the issue is there was a very clear correlation. It was in the press, all over the press. And parents were making sure that their babies would sleep with the lights off. A few years after that, Ohio State University does a very similar analysis where they found that, in fact, there was not really a causal analysis on a causality on the light. The problem was that the number one reason why the kids would have myopia was if their parents had myopia. And for some reason that they don't understand, parents with myopia would have more probability of keeping the lights on. The lights has nothing to do with the development of myopia. If you go to the newspaper today, you open a newspaper, I can guarantee you will learn at least 2 or 3 examples of correlations where the newspaper implies causation. This was one. This study says that they found a correlation between students that use Facebook and lower grades. Nothing else than that. That's what the study says. If you read the newspaper that says Facebook is the problem, you can use Facebook use can lower grades by 20%. Again, saying this just based on this might be true. We don't know. Saying this based just on the correlation is the same that saying that cell phone generates CO2. Same thing. Correlation doesn't imply causation. So the question that we're trying to say is, okay, how do we really test whether an idea works? Because we know that based on the correlation, how many minutes? 2 minutes? I need to move fast. So how do we really test whether something works? And the first thing is we actually need to run a randomized control experiment. What is a randomized control experiment? You take a bunch of, in this case, students, for example, you divide them into 2 groups. One is control, one is treatment. You need to make sure that it's random. Then you follow these guys up and you compare the results. For example, if you want to test whether Facebook was causing this problem, for the treatment, you remove the possibility for these users to use Facebook. And at the end, you measure them. If there is a significant difference between the 2, you can actually prove that that was caused by the factor you introduce. The first step is to make sure that we have an OEC, that is the overall evaluation criteria. That's the metric that we want to move. This is very important. We need to understand what metric is the metric we want to use to measure the experiment. So in a website, you take the users, you divide them into 2 groups, and then you measure analytics for the difference between the 2 groups. You need to make sure that the users are selected randomly, that you have a user ID. So if I come tomorrow to your site, if I come the next week, if I'm part of the experiments, I will see the same thing in both times. The third thing is we need to have, other than the factor we're changing, we need to make sure that we have the same amount of factors. If you're caching one page, you also need to cache the other one, because otherwise it's not apples to apples. So how do we put this into practice? And this is what we call the experimentation culture. Okay. 1 minute for the 5 minutes, correct? 12:30. Okay, I have 6 minutes. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, no cure. So, okay, so I have 6 minutes. I don't need to move so fast. In Amazon.com, back in 2000, one employee came up with the idea of making recommendations based on what the user was buying. So, for example, if a user was buying a flashlight, we would recommend him to have batteries. The senior vice president of marketing said that's a very bad idea because once the user wants to buy something and he's ready for checkout, we cannot distract that user. So he ordered not to run this experiment. Amazon, that has a very good experimentation culture, said, no, we'll run it anyway. What they found was the idea was not only good, would represent millions of dollars of revenue to Amazon. So what do we learn? Given any idea, I can guarantee there will be a lot of good arguments and the arguments against any of this idea. The argument that the vice president had was actually very real. You cannot distract the user, that's real. And this would distract the user, that's real. But you still need to run an experiment and test. What is the cultural problem that we typically have in organizations? If the idea works, if any idea works, we usually reward the individual. But if the idea fails, we look who to blame. And this is the problem because remember, 75% of the ideas will fail. So if we start looking to who to blame for any idea that fails, at the end of the day, the only thing that we will get is that people will not want to experiment. Upton Sinclair has it very clear. It says, if it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. All right? If we look who to blame and we blame people when they fail, they will not run experiments. If we want an experimentation culture, we need to understand that an idea that fails is not an error. Ideas will fail. This is part of the innovation process. The principal enemy of the experimentation is, we call it HIPPO. Stands for highest paid person opinion. And I'm pretty sure we have a few of those here in the room. Or you work with someone like that. Why? Well, this is the person that typically takes the decision and can actually decide without an experiment whether an idea is good or not. I can guarantee 75% of the time that person will be wrong. Okay, so what did we see today? If we want to innovate, we need to understand what ideas work and which ideas do not work and take the ones that work. In order to do that, we need to prove causality. If we want to prove causality, the gold standard is to use control experiments. But that's not enough. We need an experimentation culture, and that starts with the idea we need to understand that ideas will fail, and those are not errors. Ideas will fail, and that's part of the process. I don't know if any one of you wants to become a data scientist or are data scientists. That data science is not only about learning how to use Hadoop, Impala, SciPy, you name it. That's good and that's required to use data, but you need to understand how to use the data and what the data is telling you. You need to understand the difference between correlation and causation. You need to know how to design a control experiment and run it. I leave some tools here. There's a few papers. There's an A/B testing framework in Python. I haven't used it myself, but I'm pretty sure it's good. And there's another book that is How to Measure Anything. If you have any questions, please let me know. Any questions?
I have a quick question about, you mentioned culture and experimentation and sort of advocating, against the hippos or whatever. So in your opinion, what is a good strategy to convince a hippo that experimentation is valid? How you know what I mean? That experimentation is worthy and necessary, and to demonstrate.
It is hard. It is very difficult because a lot of the organizations have it there. How we did it was we created these hippos, and I can give you one for the question. And after that, we start actually showing the results. You would go and you would ask the same question that we have here, say, which of these ideas are better? And everybody will make an opinion. By just doing that, you will see that there will be a lot of people that thinks that one idea is better than the other one. So by doing that, just not everybody thinks an idea is a good idea, especially in website design or those things. And after that, you would tell them, say, let's run a control experiment and test. When people realize that they were wrong, after the third or fourth time they were wrong, people start believing more in experimentation. Of course, you will get a lot of people that say, I don't believe the results, because I'm not so convinced that the idea is a good idea that I will not believe the results. It takes time, it takes effort to do that.
Oh, sorry, that's all the time that we have right now.
Thank you very much.